It was the smell that first tipped me off. Hospitals always have that distinct antiseptic odor, but this was different, intimate and misplaced, like a hint of cologne that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't mine. Claire was sitting up in bed, holding Ella, her face a picture of serenity as she gently rocked our newborn. I leaned in to kiss her forehead, and that's when I caught it again, a subtle trace of something unfamiliar. A fleeting detail, easily dismissed, but it lodged itself in my brain like a splinter. "Did a nurse spill something on you?" I asked casually, trying to keep my tone light. She looked up at me, her blue eyes wide with surprise. "What?" "No, why?" "Nothing. Just thought I smelled something odd." "Oh, maybe it's the lotion they gave me," she said, waving it off with a tired smile. I nodded, but something didn't sit right. Claire had a habit of absent-mindedly running her hand through her hair when she lied, and there it was, a quick sweep of her fingers through her dark curls. But I let it go. This was supposed to be a joyful time. I wasn't going to ruin it with paranoia. The day moved on as expected. Nurses came and went. Visitors dropped by to coo over Ella and bring Claire flowers and snacks. Everything felt normal, or at least, it should have. That damn smell kept tugging at me, though, a stubborn itch I couldn't scratch. It lingered every time I leaned close to Claire, subtle but undeniable. Later that evening, when the room had emptied and Ella was asleep, I offered to fetch some water for Claire. I needed an excuse to clear my head. As I walked down the corridor toward the family lounge, I noticed a figure at the far end of the hallway, a man in scrubs, leaning casually against the wall, staring at his phone. Something about him seemed familiar. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the confident posture of someone used to being in control. His face was partially obscured, but when he looked up, I froze. He looked up too quickly, saw me watching, and immediately ducked into a nearby room. His reaction was odd, too quick, too deliberate. Why did he seem familiar? And why was my heart suddenly pounding in my chest? When I returned to Claire's room, I couldn't shake the image of that man. I asked casually, "Do you know a Dr. Collins? He looks like he might have been your OB or something?" Claire tensed for a fraction of a second, but long enough for me to notice. "Yeah, he's been checking in on me," she said, her voice too neutral, too rehearsed. A seed of doubt had been planted. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the weight of that small, seemingly insignificant detail began to grow. It wasn't until the following afternoon that my suspicions began to harden into something unshakable. The hospital had arranged for Claire to be discharged, and I had come back with Max to take her and Ella home. Max was thrilled to meet his baby sister, bouncing with excitement as he held a "Welcome Home, Ella" sign he'd made with markers and glitter. Claire seemed radiant as she cradled Ella in her arms, but that trace of tension remained just beneath the surface. She'd been careful, almost too careful, to mask it with an air of maternal bliss. Yet, every so often, I noticed her eyes darting to the door or her hand fiddling with the bracelet she always wore. It wasn't like her. The nurse who came to help us pack up was chatty, going on about post-discharge instructions and baby care tips. Then she slipped, just for a moment. "Dr. Collins wanted me to remind you about your follow-up appointment," she said with a smile that felt oddly knowing. Claire's face tightened imperceptibly before she replied, "Of course. Thanks." Max tugged at my sleeve, eager for me to take a picture of him holding Ella. I obliged, but my mind was elsewhere. Something about the way the nurse said his name, like it carried weight. Like it meant something more. We got Claire and Ella settled into the car and drove home, Max peppering Claire with questions about the baby. I focused on the road, keeping the conversation light, but the pieces were starting to align in my head. I knew Claire well enough to recognize when she was deflecting, and her answers to Max's innocent questions felt hollow, rehearsed. Once we arrived home, the routine of settling in took over. Claire went upstairs to nurse Ella, and I stayed downstairs to entertain Max. It was when I went to grab Ella's diaper bag from the car that I found it, a small card tucked into one of the side pockets, the kind they use for prescriptions. It wasn't the card itself that set off alarms, but what was scrawled on the back in hurried, looping handwriting: "Thanks for yesterday. See you soon. T." My stomach tightened as I stared at the card. It wasn't addressed to Claire directly, but the timing and placement left little room for misinterpretation. Who was T? And why was this buried in our baby's diaper bag? I took the card inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. Claire came down a little while later, Ella sleeping soundly in her arms. She smiled at me, but the warmth didn't reach her eyes. I watched her closely as she placed Ella in her bassinet and reached for a glass of water. "What's this?" I asked, holding up the card. Claire's eyes flicked to it briefly, then back to me. "Oh, that must have been from one of the nurses," she said, too quickly. "You know how they're always leaving little notes of encouragement." "That's funny," I replied evenly, "because it doesn't look like something a nurse would write." "And why would they stick it in Ella's diaper bag?" Her grip on the glass tightened. "I don't know, Eric. Maybe it was just misplaced." It was the kind of response that screamed, "Don't dig further." But I wasn't about to let it go. "And who's T?" "I have no idea," she snapped, the sharpness in her tone betraying her mounting discomfort. "Why are you making such a big deal out of this? We just brought our daughter home, and you're already picking fights over nothing." I didn't push further, not yet. But the seed of doubt had grown roots. That evening, I decided I needed answers. Claire went to bed early with Ella, exhausted from the day. Once the house was quiet, I began to retrace the events of the past few days. I logged into our shared medical insurance portal to review the hospital visit, just a precaution, I told myself. It didn't take long to find something strange. Claire had an extra consultation listed for 2 days before Ella's birth. The physician named? Dr. Collins. My heart raced as I stared at the screen. Claire had never mentioned seeing him outside of routine checkups. What could she possibly have needed a consultation for at 39 weeks pregnant? The next morning, I made an excuse to leave the house early. Just picking up a few things from the store, I told Claire, who was groggy from a long night with Ella. Instead, I drove straight to the hospital. If there was more to this story, I was going to find it. Hospitals are funny places, they run on a delicate balance of bureaucracy and chaos. Getting information wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. I asked for a copy of Claire's consultation records, claiming it was for insurance purposes. After some paperwork and a sympathetic clerk who didn't ask too many questions, I had it. The notes were brief but damning. Dr. Collins had seen Claire for what was vaguely listed as a personal matter unrelated to her pregnancy. The phrasing was careful, but it hinted at something more intimate. I drove home in a haze, alternating between anger, disbelief, and an unrelenting need for clarity. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I felt like I'd been carrying the weight of this secret for years, not hours. Claire was in the kitchen when I walked in, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. She looked up and smiled, but her expression faltered when she saw my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. I placed the consultation notes on the counter between us. "Care to explain this?" Her face went pale. "Eric, That smell," I cut her off, my voice colder than I intended. The cologne. The tension. The note in the diaper bag. And now this. "Tell me the truth, Claire." For a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. Finally, she sighed and looked away. "It's not what you think," she said softly, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Then what is it?" I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like you're hiding something." Claire didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, the weight of her silence louder than any confession. The silence in the kitchen after Claire left was unbearable. I could hear the faint sound of Ella's soft breathing through the baby monitor on the counter, a painful contrast to the chaos in my mind. The consultation notes sat in front of me, mocking me with their clinical ambiguity. I didn't know whether to feel furious, betrayed, or pathetic for not seeing the signs earlier. But one thing was certain, I wasn't letting this go. I found Claire sitting in our bedroom, holding Ella in her arms, staring blankly at the wall. She looked up when I entered but didn't say a word. The quiet stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, crossing my arms. "Start talking," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She shifted uncomfortably, adjusting Ella as if the baby was some kind of shield. "I don't know what you want me to say, Eric. How about the truth? That'd be a good start." Claire sighed and looked down at Ella. "Can we do this later?" She just fell asleep. "No," I said firmly. "We're doing this now. I'm not going to sit here playing happy family while you avoid whatever the hell this is." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she was going to tell me to leave. Instead, she stood up, carefully placing Ella in the bassinet before turning to face me. "It's not what you think," she started, but I cut her off. "Stop saying that," I snapped. "Because so far, all I've got are vague answers, a suspicious note, and a medical record that doesn't make any sense. You're going to have to give me more than that." Claire's eyes flashed with anger. "Fine. You want the truth? Here it is." I saw Dr. Collins because I wasn't sure if she stopped herself, shaking her head. "If what?" I pressed. She hesitated, and I could see the war raging in her mind. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "Because I wasn't sure if Ella was yours." The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was as if the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me suspended in a free fall. I stared at her, hoping I'd misheard, that this was some kind of sick joke. "What?" The word came out as a whisper. Claire's face crumpled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. "I don't know how it happened," she said, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake. It was one time. A stupid, horrible mistake." "Who?" My voice was cold now, devoid of emotion. She looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "Dr. Collins." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "The doctor? The one who delivered our daughter?" "That's who you..." I stopped myself, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "You cheated on me with him, and now you're telling me you didn't know if Ella was mine?" Claire flinched at the venom in my voice but didn't respond. The silence was deafening, filled with unspoken words and shattered trust. "Unbelievable," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "How long have you been lying to me?" "It wasn't like that," she said quickly. "It was one time, Eric. I swear." I hated myself for it. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't. And then I found out I was pregnant, and I panicked. "So you decided to just, what? Pretend it never happened? Hope it all worked out in your favor?" I laughed bitterly. "Real solid plan, Claire." She stood up then, her own anger flaring. "What was I supposed to do, Eric? Tell you while I was pregnant? Risk ruining everything? I was trying to protect our family." "Protect our family?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You didn't protect anything. You destroyed it the second you slept with him." Claire's face crumpled again, but I didn't care. My sympathy had run dry. "Why him?" I asked, my voice quieter now but no less cutting. "Why would you even?" "I don't know," she interrupted. "I don't have a good answer for you, okay?" It was a moment of weakness. I was stressed, and he was there. "Convenient," I said, the word dripping with sarcasm. "So while I was out here working my ass off to provide for this family, you were busy having moments of weakness with the guy who was supposed to be your doctor." She didn't respond, her silence only fueling my rage. "And Ella," I continued. "What about her? Is she mine, or is she his?" "She's yours," Claire said quickly, her voice desperate. "I had a paternity test done before she was born. That's why I saw him 2 days before delivery. He ran the test. She's yours, Eric. I swear." "You expect me to just take your word for it?" I said, shaking my head. "Because your track record with honesty isn't exactly stellar right now." "I'll show you the results," she said. "They're in my email. I'll give you the password." Whatever you need to believe me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was spinning with everything I just learned. Claire stood there, watching me, her expression a mixture of fear and guilt. I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers to questions I hadn't even formed yet. But instead, I turned and walked out of the room. I needed air. I needed to think. Most of all, I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. Claire's promise that Ella was mine had sounded desperate, but the email she handed me seemed legitimate. The paternity test results confirmed it. I was listed as Ella's biological father. For a moment, the fire in my chest cooled. Maybe it really had been just one terrible mistake, something I could process, maybe even forgive. But the doubt wouldn't leave me. Back at home, the house was oppressively silent. Claire moved around with caution, like she was afraid any wrong step might reignite my fury. Ella's coos from her bassinet were the only sounds breaking the tension. I knew I couldn't let this rest until I had absolute clarity, no matter how much I wanted to believe her. That evening, I called the hospital under the pretense of needing copies of Claire's medical records for our insurance company. The clerk on the phone was helpful, and within 24 hours, the records, including the original paternity test results, were emailed to me. When I opened the file, I stared at the page, frozen. 2 words screamed at me from the document: not the father. My chest felt like it had been cracked open. The doubts I had tried to suppress came roaring back with brutal clarity. Claire had lied. Not just about the affair, but about the paternity of the child I had cradled, sung to, and dreamed about raising. This betrayal wasn't just an attack on me, it was an attack on everything I had built my life around. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the knowledge that Ella wasn't mine or the realization that Claire had gone to such lengths to deceive me. It felt like a mockery of every promise we'd ever made to each other. But now, it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about consequences. I sat at the dining table late into the night, mapping out my next steps. There was no shouting match that could make up for what she'd done. Claire had counted on my love for her and Ella to cloud my judgment, to keep me complacent. But now, my clarity was a weapon, and I was going to use it. The first thing I did was secure the documentation. I printed out both sets of paternity results, the one Claire had given me and the one I'd obtained from the hospital. I made copies of her medical records, including the consultation notes with Dr. Collins. Every piece of evidence was placed in a neat, damning file. Next, I called a divorce attorney. Claire didn't know this yet, but I wasn't going to let her dictate the terms of how our marriage ended. The attorney was sharp, efficient, and immediately started laying out my options. With the evidence I had a strong case to contest custody of Max and protect my financial assets. Then came the more personal part of the plan. I waited until the weekend to confront Claire. Max was staying at my sister's house, and Ella was asleep in her room. Claire was in the living room, scrolling mindlessly on her phone, when I dropped the folder on the coffee table in front of her. She looked up, startled. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. She hesitated but complied. As her eyes scanned the documents, her face turned pale. She stopped at the hospital paternity test, her hands trembling. "You lied to me," I said. "You gave me fake results to make me think Ella was mine." "I didn't lie," she stammered. I thought she was yours." I was scared. "Save it," I cut her off. "The test from the hospital doesn't lie, Claire. Ella isn't mine. She's his." Tears welled up in her eyes, but they did nothing to move me. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered. "I thought. You thought you could manipulate me," I said coldly. "You thought you could trap me in this mess you created. But guess what, Claire? It didn't work." She tried to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "This marriage is over. I've already spoken to a lawyer. We're filing for divorce, and I'll be seeking full custody of Max." Her head snapped up at that. "You can't take Max away from me," she said, her voice rising. "He's my son too. Do you think any judge is going to side with you after they see this?" I said, gesturing to the folder. You cheated. You lied. You've made a mockery of this family. You're lucky I don't take this to every friend and family member we have. Over the next few weeks, I set my plan into motion. Claire had no idea what was coming. While she scrambled to maintain some semblance of normalcy, I was working behind the scenes to dismantle the facade she'd built. First, I contacted Dr. Collins. Using an anonymous email account, I sent him copies of the hospital paternity test and a brief note. I thought you might want to know the truth about your daughter. Then, I went to his employer. I filed a formal complaint with the hospital administration, detailing his unprofessional conduct and attaching the consultation notes from Claire's records. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about ensuring that someone like him faced consequences for exploiting his position. Lastly, I made sure Claire felt the weight of her actions every single day. I moved into the guest room, spoke to her only when absolutely necessary, and made it clear to Max, without badmouthing her, that changes were coming. He was a bright kid. He could tell something was wrong. The day Claire and I sat down to finalize the details of our separation was a strange one. By then, most of the heavy lifting had been done. The divorce papers were filed, custody arrangements for Max were in progress, and I had already begun the process of disentangling myself from the life I'd shared with her. The only thing left was the confrontation I'd been avoiding, the final, raw conversation where everything was laid bare. It was late in the evening when I walked into the living room, where Claire sat nursing Ella. She looked worn, as if the weight of everything had finally pressed down on her. Her usual confidence, the one that once drew me to her, was gone. All that remained was the shell of a woman grappling with the consequences of her actions. We need to talk, I said, standing across from her. She glanced at me, then at Ella, and sighed. Let me put her down first. I nodded, watching as she carefully carried Ella to the bassinet in the corner. When she returned, she sat on the edge of the couch, avoiding my gaze. You've already made your decision, she said quietly. What's left to say? A lot, I replied. For starters, I need to know why. She looked up at me then, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. Why? She echoed. You mean why I betrayed you? Why I risked everything? Yeah, I said bluntly. Why you threw away a decade of marriage and a family for, what? A moment of weakness? An ego boost? Claire flinched at the harshness in my tone but didn't argue. It wasn't about you, she said softly. It was about me. I don't know, overwhelmed. Lost. I didn't know how to handle everything. You mean being pregnant and raising a kid while I was busting my ass to support this family? I shot back. That was too much for you? She shook her head, wiping at her eyes. It wasn't like that. I felt invisible, Eric. Like I was just a mom, just a wife, and nothing else. Dr. Collins made me feel seen. Her words hit a nerve, but I refused to let her see it. So, you needed someone to validate you, and that justified sleeping with him? Lying to me? Letting me believe Ella was mine? Claire's tears spilled over then, but they didn't soften me. I never wanted to hurt you, she said, her voice cracking. I was scared. I didn't know how to fix what I'd done. You could have started by telling me the truth, I said. But you didn't. You chose to lie. You chose to manipulate me into thinking Ella was mine, even when you knew she wasn't. Do you have any idea how that feels? I do, she whispered. Every day since it happened, I've hated myself for it. I've wanted to tell you so many times, but I was terrified of losing you. Losing us. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. You managed to lose everything anyway. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the baby monitor. Claire sat with her head in her hands, while I leaned against the wall, trying to collect my thoughts. Finally, I broke the silence. What happens now? I asked, my voice quieter. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. I'm moving out next week. Max will stay with me until the custody agreement is finalized. As for Ella, she's not my responsibility. Claire's face crumpled. You can't just walk away from her. She's innocent in all this. Innocent or not, she's not mine, I said firmly. Her father is Dr. Collins. Let him take care of her. But you've bonded with her, she said desperately. You've been there since the moment she was born. That doesn't just disappear. It does when it's built on a lie, I replied. I can't be a father to a child who isn't mine, not when every time I look at her, I'll be reminded of what you did. Claire sobbed quietly, but I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. Do you even want to try to fix this? Claire asked eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. Fix what? I shot back. Our marriage? The life you destroyed? Tell me how, Claire. How do I fix years of trust that you shattered in one night? I don't know, she admitted. But I'm willing to try. To do whatever it takes. It's too late for that, I said. You had your chance, and you blew it. There's no coming back from this. She nodded slowly, as if she'd known all along that this was where we'd end up. What about Max? She asked. Are you going to turn him against me? I shook my head. I won't say a word about this to him. But he's not stupid. He'll figure it out eventually, and when he does, you'll have to explain it to him. Claire winced but didn't argue. And for the record, I added, this isn't about revenge. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing it because I deserve better. Max deserves better. She nodded again, her tears flowing freely now. I'm sorry, she said, her voice broken. For everything. I'm sure you are, I replied. But sorry doesn't fix this. The next morning, I began packing my things. Claire stayed out of my way, and Max was still at my sister's, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing at home. When I finally loaded the last box into my car, I turned to Claire one last time. This is it, I said. She nodded, holding Ella tightly. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday. I didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't on the table, not now. Maybe not ever. On the day I left the house for good, I looked back at Claire one last time. She stood in the doorway, holding Ella, tears streaming down her face. I felt nothing but a hollow sense of relief. This wasn't the life I'd signed up for, but it was the one I was walking away from. The first few weeks after leaving Claire felt surreal. I moved into a small rental house on the other side of town, close enough to Max's school but far enough away that I didn't have to run into Claire unless it was necessary. The house was modest, 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a small backyard. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of autonomy, though it was bittersweet. Max was confused at first, unsure why we'd moved out, but I kept my explanations simple and honest. Your mom and I aren't getting along, and we think it's better this way. He accepted it for now, but I knew there would come a day when he'd want the full truth. I wasn't looking forward to that conversation, but I promised myself I'd be ready when it came. Claire didn't fight me on the custody arrangement, at least not openly. She must have realized the evidence I had against her would tip the scales in my favor. My lawyer made quick work of the divorce proceedings, and within 3 months, I had primary custody of Max. Claire was granted weekends, but the agreement left little room for negotiation. What surprised me most was her demeanor throughout the process. She didn't lash out or try to turn Max against me. Instead, she seemed resigned, as if she knew she'd lost more than just our marriage. I wondered if she'd ever fully grasped the damage she'd done, not just to me but to Max and even Ella, who would grow up with the weight of her mother's choices. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Dr. Collins didn't escape unscathed. My complaint to the hospital had sparked an internal investigation, and it turned out Claire wasn't the first patient he'd crossed professional boundaries with. He was forced to resign, his reputation in tatters. At least Ella's father wouldn't be practicing medicine anymore, potentially exploiting other vulnerable women. One evening, several weeks after the divorce was finalized, Claire asked if we could meet. Max was at a friend's house for a sleepover, so I reluctantly agreed. She arrived at my rental house just after sunset, holding a box in her hands. I'm not here to cause trouble, she said when I opened the door. I wanted to give you this. She handed me the box, and I hesitated before opening it. Inside were a collection of photos, letters, and mementos from our years together, wedding pictures, anniversary cards, notes we'd written each other during the early days of our relationship. At the very bottom was a framed photo of us holding Max as a baby, both of us beaming with the unfiltered joy of new parents. I thought you might want these, Claire said softly. Even if we didn't work out, those years weren't all bad. I looked at her, searching for any hint of manipulation or insincerity, but she seemed genuine. For a brief moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. Thanks, I said, setting the box on the counter. But this doesn't change anything. I know, she replied. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. The apology was long overdue, but it didn't stir the emotions I thought it might. Instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to complete since the day I discovered her betrayal. Closure, if such a thing exists. I hope you figure things out, I said, opening the door to signal the end of our conversation. For your sake and for Ella's. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Take care, Eric. You too. And just like that, she was gone.